This week on Quadriga, G7, no Putin, no point? When the G7 summit kicks off at Schloss Elmau this weekend, all eyes will be on the host, German Chancellor Angela Merkel. She'll be welcoming the heads of leading industrial nations. But with a number of powerful emerging economies excluded, the G7 is losing relevance, say some experts. And sidelining Russia over the Ukraine conflict may have weakened the club still further. Coming to you from Berlin, Quadriga, the international debate. Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Are we taking the right approach to Russia? And what can the G7 accomplish with or without Mr. Putin? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga with three people who've been following the G7 preparations very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Donata Riedel. She is reporting from Berlin on economic and financial sector policy for Germany's main business newspaper, the Handelsblatt. She says Russia always was an outsider in the club of the G7. And Johannes Leithäuser, who writes on German politics and European and foreign affairs for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, he says G20 is more honest than G7. And it's a pleasure to have Alan Posener back on the show. He was born in London, grew up in Kuala Lumpur and Berlin, and he's author of numerous books as well as a regular commentator for the German newspaper Die Welt. He says the G7 was a silly idea, a kind of world economic government, and it cannot work. Johannes Leithäuser, the German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier has been saying for some time that Germany cannot afford to isolate Russia and it needs to find a diplomatic solution with Russia. Wouldn't the G7 have been just the right place to try to do that?
I don't think so. I think we are trying hard to find a solution with Russia, and we're using all kinds of diplomatic channels. Chancellor Merkel is on the phone with President Putin all the time. And others are trying to find ways. But a year ago, we formally excluded Russia from this club, from this G7 or G8 club, as it was then. And that was meant as a part of sanctions, as an informal sign or gesture that we wouldn't tolerate what Russia did with the Crimea and what it still does up to the day in eastern Ukraine. So why would we, since these things have not changed, why would we admit them back into this group now?
But in fact, if it's about penalizing Russia for its illegal annexation of the Crimea, Donata Riedel, that is exactly what the economic sanctions are for. So what's to be gained by perpetuating the exclusion of Russia from the G7?
Well, so far there hasn't been enough movement on Putin's side to solve this conflict. I mean, if we see the Minsk agreement has not been implemented, Putin didn't do anything to calm down the conflict in the East Ukraine. And as long as this is the case, how could the G7 say, OK, come back to our club? The reasons why Putin has been excluded last year, they are still the same. So you just couldn't have him back in the club.
But Western leaders keep telling us, Alan Posener, that they need Russia to help solve Syria, to help solve Yemen, to help work things out with Iran, Libya. How are they going to do that if they refuse to talk to Vladimir Putin?
Well, no one's refusing to talk to him, as Johannes pointed out. Merkel talks to Putin all the time. Obama sent Kerry to talk to him just recently. You know, and fine, that's what you've got to do. But the fact is that you can say what you like about how much we need Putin. He's not actually helping on any of these issues. He's not helping rein in his Mr. Assad in Syria. He's not helping us with the Iranians. He's sold them anti-aircraft missiles, which they need to protect their nuclear facilities. He's doing his thing in the Ukraine. Just yesterday, they started a new offensive against all agreements which we've made with him. So to say, oh, invite him to Schloss Elmau, toast him with champagne, give him a couple of minutes with the press and we're going to solve problems, that seems to me hardly the thing to do. I think he has to see that we're going to stick by our guns and we don't consider him part of the club.
Johannes Leithäuser, doesn't it arguably make him more intransigent to exclude him in this mostly really symbolic way?
I think, I don't know whether there's a chance of making him more intransigent than he already is. If we would invite him, we would create a domestic success for him. His domestic approval rates are already high, so he would felt justified in what he has done so far. Why would we want to give him this prize? I mean, if you look at the membership of Russia in this club as a whole, they were not coming to the table 18 years ago because of their economic power, because we considered they had a right to belong to this G7 circle of the biggest economic powers of the world. It was a gesture then to invite Russia, and there's no justification as such, because still the Russian economy is far, far smaller than, for example, the Chinese community. So if we would have to invite others, we would have to invite other countries, probably.
But in political terms, Donate Riedel, would you also agree with Alan Posener that Russia really has nothing to contribute? Security issues are high on the agenda of this G7. We've seen John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, recently travel to Moscow to talk to Vladimir Putin about those issues. Does it really not make sense to try to open channels of communication to Russia here?
Yes, of course, it would be a good idea. Well, I mean, there are discussions and there are talks between all the G7 countries and Russia. And Russia is still member of the G20 group, where we have China and India and Brazil, for example, as well, which are far bigger economies than Russia is. I mean, Johannes is perfectly right. When the idea to have Russia in the G7 and making them G8 stems from the early 1990s, when there was still the Soviet Union, and the general idea was when the Great Wall came down and all borders opened, that we wanted to integrate Russia into the club of wealthy and democratic nations. And this never happened, really. It took quite some time till Russia actually became a member of the club in 1998. And after that, we didn't see more democracy in Russia. It was just the opposite. And it was on all those G20 meetings, G7, G8 meetings, that it was, in a way, G7 plus Russia. And and if we look...
This is why your initial statement that I read off just a bit ago said that Russia's always been an outsider in the club. But sometimes outsiders can push the club to think about new things.
Yes, sometimes they can, but in this case it was always like, well, the rest of them had to sort of try to be in contact with Russia, and they couldn't really interact among themselves. So I don't think that the outcome was fruitful in this constellation. I mean, I definitely don't say don't speak to Putin, just the opposite, but in this club of G7, as it is, it's democracies, it's old industrialized economies. They have some very different problems than they had in the 90s and before. So the club has to sort of sort it out in itself. So if we look at what the world is now and what it might be in the future, I can't see that this format of G8 really can create any kind of solutions.
Okay, I want to come back to that, but I want to see if I can shake up this consensus just a little bit. In fact, there is a consensus on the part of two of Germany's most revered former social democratic chancellors that excluding Russia doesn't make sense. Former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, who's seen here with the Russian writer Daniel Granin in late 2014, said he found Russia's exclusion from the G7 meeting, quote, unhelpful. And another former chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, also says it is a mistake not to invite Vladimir Putin to the G7 summit. He put it this way: Russia has an alternative to Europe, but that's not the case in reverse. Alan Posener, I guess those remarks do nothing to convince you?
No, I mean, look, Mr. Schröder is basically an agent for Gazprom. He's paid by them, basically. Gazprom, the Russian state-owned a gas company. And he's as much a part of that clique as is Putin, who controls at the center. So whatever he says, I mean, you just forget it. That is basically Moscow state propaganda. As for Helmut Schmidt, he created this stupid organization of a group of statesmen at the time coming together and pretending they could solve all the world's problems. He didn't then. They're not going to now. The only thing it ever was and is a propaganda, you know, is a photo op, basically, and all the declarations have already been agreed beforehand. So why give Putin this propaganda op? Precisely because the G7 isn't going to do anything to change any problems. It's purely propaganda. Don't give Putin this platform.
I mean, I think if we would invite him, he could maximize his profit if he wouldn't show up. You see, maybe we sparing him the opportunity.
He did that once in 2012, didn't he? Didn't show up.
To say no, thank you, I'm not coming. I mean, you are trying to punish me economically. Why would I join your economic club to debate things?
Let's not give him that chance.
Johannes Leithäuser, granted, Gerhard Schröder, the former chancellor we just saw there, he does have strong ties to Russia. He is chairman of the board of a subsidiary of the energy company Gazprom. But does that automatically disqualify his argument that Germany needs good economic relations with Russia?
We do need economic relations and good ones with Russia, or at least they would be desirable. There are dependencies. We are dependent on Russian gas, for instance, for part of our gas supply. So yes, but we can't overcome, of course, this development that, as the German Chancellor would say, Russia is suddenly no longer playing by the rules that have been agreed in the post-Second World War order in Europe. And because if we start to do this here, we can't stop this trend elsewhere when other autocratic rulers get ideas about, well, what kind of territory should belong to their empire or not. So we have made a decision, and we have to stick to this decision, meaning economic sanctions, not inviting him to Elmau. Nevertheless, I think it's true what Chancellor Schröder hinted at, that Russia can try to form new bands with China. They can try to get more integrated, but I would say good luck with that. I don't think it will lead so very far.
So you disagree with his premise that Russia has good alternatives. Let us take a look at exactly what the sanctions do mean to the German economy. Here's a short report.
With Western sanctions against Russia in place, container transshipment in Hamburg's port slowed compared to before the Ukraine crisis. Many German companies have been hit hard by the downturn in their exports to Russia. The German business community is critical of the measures.
In a globalized world, in a globalized economy, sanctions only work if everyone abides by them. That is not the case here. If German firms are not allowed to supply certain goods, then others will step into the breach. And we already see that Chinese businesses, for example, are trying to take the place of German companies.
So, Donata Riedel, as we saw there, a number of members of the German business community do share former Chancellor Schröder's view. They say both excluding Mr. Putin from the summit and also the economic sanctions themselves are counterproductive. Give us your assessment. You report regularly on business and economic matters. How much are the sanctions hurting both sides, Russia and Germany?
Well, of course, they are hurting both sides. They are hurting Russia more severely than the German side because for the German industry, Russia is one partner, and for Russia, the sanctions mean that they are sort of cut off from world markets and partly from world finances, and we see that Russia is near a severe recession this year, and so for Russia it's quite harmful. And of course, for some companies and for some branches of the German industry, it's quite bad to have those sanctions in place. But I mean, we have Mr. Cordes, who is very involved in the trade with Russia.
He's the head of the Eastern European Committee of the German business community.
Yes, he is.
So he has a definite vested interest here, doesn't he?
Yes, he has. And we have other representatives of the German industry, like Mr. Grillo from the industry committee, who says that it is entirely up to the government and to the politicians to decide whether there are sanctions or whether there are no sanctions, and the economy has to follow politics on this field, and I very much agree with this view on the sanctions towards Russia.
But, Alan Posener, doesn't a deepening economic divide also exacerbate political tensions? We've just seen those ratcheting up another notch. Russia has now banned 89 European politicians from entering the country. And recently, border police in Russia turned away a very well-known German member of parliament who has strong knowledge on Russia, who had been seeking to mediate the conflict with Russia. Surely all of this is a really distressing exacerbation of the tension.
Well, yes, it's distressing, but if that's the way Mr. Putin wants it, that's the way he's going to get it. I mean, come on, he could end this at once by stopping his aggression in eastern Ukraine and at least opening the Crimea question again to an internationally supervised, putting it to internationally supervised vote. Quite simply. And then the sanctions would fall immediately and he'd be back in the fold. He doesn't want to do that. The ball is in his part. And I have to say that I really, really disagree when a representative of German industry says, well, you know, if we can't sell them our stuff, they're going to go to China. There's lots and lots of stuff that they can't get in China. That's the first thing, which only Germany or European companies can give them, especially certain amounts of specialized mining equipment which they need to get the gas out of the ground. And the second thing is, if I were Mr. Putin, I'd be more afraid of a country like China than I would be of the West. I mean, we are fairly predictable. We're democracies. We're not going to do any. We don't have territorial ambitions in Russia as China has, and so on. So, I mean, who are these people trying to fool?
I think if you are in the mind of a Russian autocrat, you are far more afraid from unpredictable or of unpredictable societies that change their leaders all the time. You see. Creating new ones in a process they call democratic elections, then you're afraid of a Chinese politbureaucrat who is there for 10 years and is following a stable policy. Maybe we are not familiar enough with how Putin thinks. So.
Look, he can see what China's doing in the South China Sea, creating islands on which they want to, have industrial and military bases. And he can see what they're doing in Mongolia, where they're infiltrating Mongolia with their own people to get their mineral wealth. And he knows what's happening in Siberia, where no one knows how many Chinese people are there. I mean, he has really big problems with China.
Yes, but maybe that's a more familiar kind of conflict in his world of thinking.
Well. Yes, but I mean, we have to see that every country and every industry of every country tries to get into business with China or with India or with other countries, and not only with European countries, because those are the countries of growth. And I mean, it's okay if everybody tries to establish trade with other countries. So I wouldn't blame him for that. And
it seems to me you've all been fairly sanguine about any decline in economic relations with Russia not being much of a problem. But the International New York Times has a headline today saying that the U.S. is dependent on Russian engines in order to get some of its most sensitive, most important satellites and other equipment up into space. Donata Riedel, that actually sounds like a relationship where you definitely would want to maintain contacts. The U.S. cannot put those things into space without Russian equipment.
Yes, I didn't say we shouldn't try to solve the problem with Russia. I mean, just the opposite. I mean, I would be glad if there would be some kind of new peace between everybody and Russia coming back to the table. But at the moment, we don't see that Putin is kind of fulfilling agreements he has already made. Let's look at the Minsk agreement. He doesn't fulfill his part on that one. So what should leaders of democratic countries actually do as long as Putin doesn't stick to what he already said he would do?
Well, again, that's what the sanctions are in place for. Let us take perhaps another look at what past G7 and G8 summits have accomplished, both with and without Russia. Here's a look back at a few of the G7 summits that Russia did attend.
Those were the good old days back in 2007. Vladimir Putin being greeted by Angela Merkel at the G8 summit in Heiligendamm, with a group photo in a beach chair and a relaxed chat over a beer on saving the world. Indeed, Heiligendamm did produce a small breakthrough on climate change and a talk between Putin and George W. Bush on missile defense. Altogether, Russia took part in 16 G8 meetings at the table alongside the world's leading and wealthiest economic powers. 1998 in Birmingham was the first summit with Russia as a full member. Issues included the economic crisis in Asia and the international fight against organized crime. 2013 in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland was the last G8 summit with a Russian president. By that time, Russia was no longer merely a tolerated guest, but a self-assured power with energy and resources and its own agenda. Enniskillen saw attempts to resolve the Syrian civil war end in a compromise of little substance, reflecting the varying regional interests of the participants.
Johannes Leithäuser, no summit there where you would say that the Russian presence actually made a difference and was productive?
Well, at least he didn't hinder the ongoings, but I would not say that he made a huge difference in a way that the world was shaped in another way after the summit than before. And if you look at these pictures, you get the impression how staged these events are in general. You see, I just noticed the German Chancellor is always wearing a green jacket, and I would like to place a bet on that the jacket on the ongoing...
Maybe she just didn't bring a big suitcase with her to Heiligendamm.
Because she knew there were no talks that were in danger of being longer than scheduled or expected. So she knew she would be home in time from Heiligendamm or wherever it was.
Donata Riedel, the fact is, you said before that the G7 is a kind of a club where all the members have similar issues and similar problems. But the slogan of this G7 is think about tomorrow, and it is absolutely dedicated to long-term global issues like global warming, like security issues. Empowerment of women is on the agenda. All of them issues where any important country like Russia surely also has a stake.
Yes, but not only Russia. I mean, why don't you say China or India or Brazil or some African countries? The G7 is a sort of club that is not as important as it used to be in the 1980s or in the 1990s. We have other emerging economies who have become very, very strong countries worldwide. And of course, there has to be discussions with all of them. And for that, there is the G20, where all those countries are together and are trying to solve the problems of the world. The G7 now, in fact, although they say they are still the ones who lead the global economy, in fact they aren't. They are just the old industrialized democratic countries of the West plus Japan. And because they are not as mighty as they used to be, I think it's important for them to sort of sit together to sort out what their influence actually can be within the greater context of the G20. So I think it's good to have the G7, but they have to reform themselves within the next years. So otherwise, they won't be important at all.
Yes.
I mean, the very fact that they're having all these agenda like climate change, empowerment of women, fighting sickness in Africa and so on, these are all things where they actually, whatever they decide, remains with declarations. Because to empower women in India, it's not our job. And women are basically empowered in the West. It could go further, but we're on the way there. So climate change. There are, basically we know there's two different ways of going about it, like the European way of regulating, the American way of encouraging innovation. That's not going to change. So it's only be a declaration. Fighting tropical diseases. They're going to say we're going to fight tropical diseases. Well, which we are already doing. So I mean, it's just a whole lot of...
Well, I wouldn't be that harsh. I mean, they can...
Sorry.
They can just draw attention to these matters more than they had before, maybe, or they could find a new way.
If we go back to Heiligendamm again, there were pledges made to increase development aid. There were climate change pledges that were made there that were very, very important. For the first time, we saw President Bush really step up to the plate, partly at the prodding of the Chancellor. There were some things accomplished at Heiligendamm. The issues this time around are very, very similar, Johannes Leithäuser.
But none of these successes you just named would be justified to be called as a breakthrough, for instance. Yes, there was some...
Incremental, but still successes.
And that's... You have to bring something to this table just as a kind of present to get the attention these summits bring with them. You see, it's a media event by now. And, of course, everything is, as I say, everything is staged. So yes, the American president goes there, and of course he wants to be seen as a nice guy. So his political staff thinks, okay, what's the concession we could make without hurting ourselves too much, but to be seen as bringing progress and whatever. So these things develop. Yeah, just a bit. And then there's us, the media. We are sitting there somewhere far out in a press center, not knowing what's really going on. Maybe they're just having a coffee and a nice chat about, I don't know, FIFA or whatever. But then we're presented with conclusions, and of course, we are reporting because that's why we are there, and we are bringing this attention to the attention to this event more than maybe justified.
Donata Riedel, did you report on the G8 summit at Heiligendamm?
No, not at Heiligendamm, but on some other G7, G8 summits in the past.
Are your memories similar to the ones that we've just heard from Johannes Leithäuser?
Yeah, that's completely true, that the press is kept in a press center that is far away. And if we see at the beginning, during the 90s, the press center was a bit closer to the original venue, but it has been moved farther away from summit to summit because of terrorists, because it has become such a huge event, and every time there are more journalists coming and so on. So that's, of course, a bit difficult.
Of course, more journalists and also more protesters. As you mentioned, security considerations loom very high. You're all in agreement, once again, that the benefits of the summits are modest at best. Let's take a look at some of the costs of past summits.
Host Germany wants the country to appear at its best for the G7 summit. And that means no ugly pictures of protesters. Some 25,000 police officers have been deployed to ensure security for the world leaders. They're checking garbage cans and patrolling the nearby Austrian border. The estimated cost of the event, around 130 million euros. The German Taxpayers Federation says it may even amount to 360 million euros. Critics say that's too much money for too few results.
Alan Posener, you said in that opening statement that I quoted at the beginning of the report, the G7 was a silly idea, a kind of world economic government that didn't work then and it can't work today. So are you saying we should simply get rid of it, given that the cost is so high, those beautiful fields are going to be trampled, the pollution from all the security vehicles, and so on and so forth? Many people in Germany say the environmental destruction definitely outweighs any benefits. I gather you agree.
Well, no environmental lots of things get destroyed. Soccer matches destroy the environment. Rock concerts in fields destroy the environment. I'm still in favour of soccer matches and rock concerts.
But not the G7.
Not the G7, no. But not because it destroys the environment, but just because it's an exercise in futility. All the declarations have already been worked out in advance by so-called Sherpas who've met and so on. I'm not worried about the money either. Goodness, we spend so much money on so many stupid things. That's not the point. The point is that it suggests a power to change the world which these politicians don't have. I mean, Mr. Obama, the most powerful person in the world, if he's the most powerful person in the world, then God help us, because he doesn't have any power. Anything he agrees to or would agree to in Elmau, he can't get through Congress anyway. So what's the point? And, Merkel can do basically what she wants, but she's really the only leader in that whole setup who can actually act. So, that's my point. My point is it's just not worth the bother.
But the American notion towards climate change, for instance, has changed over recent years, and I think Obama has played a part in that.
Yeah, but not because he attended G7 summits, because people in California, are feeling the effects.
There are two...
But G7 is just one format where they meet and where they talk. I mean, of course, the concrete outcome is sometimes it's very small, sometimes it's a bit bigger. But if we see how the discussions of climate change have become a topic worldwide, G7 has done something to achieve that. So, of course, it's not the world leaders who come together for 2 days and solve all the problems of the world. That's quite a silly idea.
Johannes Leithäuser, if we look back to the origins of the original G7, Alan Posener was a bit caustic about them as well, but I wonder whether you see in those origins any ideas that we could perhaps think about as a means of rebuilding the G7 to make it actually a workable and constructive format?
I think the most important element or idea in the beginning was that the meetings should be held in an informal way. So important people, then more important as they are now, because there was no emerging powers like China or Brazil or others to be seen in the mid-70s of the last century. But having a kind of exchange without set agenda and having time to spend with each other, there's nothing to be said against that anyway. But to find a closed space for them once a year, I think that's really necessary. But they themselves, with our help, the media, the public, whoever, have somehow developed this in quite the contrary thing. Now, as you mentioned, they are they are just announcing world problems would be solved when they part each other after 2 days. They would find solutions for tropical diseases. They would stop climate change. They would do all kinds of things. That's, I think, this approach has to falter. They can't succeed in this.
Donata Riedel, as the economic crisis began to develop, 2007, 2008, it was actually the G20 that went into high gear, met several times, rather impromptu gatherings in some cases. Do we simply need to get rid of the G7 and move to a G20 format?
I think we have already moved to G20. G20 is the more important format already since the financial crisis, because all the topics about regulation of financial markets and about fighting tax evasion and some very concrete topics to solve the problems that stemmed from the financial crisis have been solved within the G20 setting. But I think it's okay to keep the G7 as well as a more informal kind of meeting of the Western leaders and of the democratic leaders to discuss among themselves what the problems of the world are. I don't think that the G7 really can bring solutions within those meetings, but I think it's good if they meet and if they talk and if they agree on the level of democratic powers. So as well, a kind of preparation also for G20 summits.
A number of the issues that are on the agenda of this summit are governance issues, Alan Posener, issues that at least in some way have to do with transparent, good governance. G20 is not a club with lots of members, a majority of members who can really boast of good governance. There are a number of countries in that group that are, in fact, pretty bad at governance. Yeah. Does that tell us that maybe it does make sense for this other club to remain in existence?
Well, in the sense that we've said that sort of if it were an informal club, people sitting together and not issuing any declarations, simply working towards concrete solutions of concrete problems, shall we say governance, that might be a good idea. I mean, these Western democratic capitalist societies, we do have a very important agenda. That is the expansion of free trade, for instance, most especially between the European Union and North America. TTIP, it's called. Now, because if we could agree on this free trade area with common standards of trade, accountability, and so on, product standards, then we could enforce these basically on the world, because we still are, Europe and America, the two greatest economies, markets in the world. So, you know, if they really sat down for 2 days in a locked room, somewhere where we didn't know they were there, and they came out with an agreement on TTIP.
The helicopters would tell us, flying around.
Okay. Not to mention the protesters. If they were here, they would definitely be up in arms.
Then I say, fine, finally break this deadlock, finally get ahead on one issue and leave all this talk about women's empowerment and climate change and stuff. Just leave it. Do something. Don't waffle.
Let me perhaps come back to the title of our show, No Putin, No Point, as you remember. Johannes Leithäuser, there's one other format out there that's a kind of a compromise format. It was actually devised in Heiligendamm, and it's called the Heiligendamm process. And it involves the G7 or G8 in that case, on the last day, inviting 5 special guests to join them, the 5 biggest emerging economies. The group is called the Outreach 5, a rather creative title. Is there some kind of a compromise idea there in which Putin could be included? Let's say the G7 meets, but on the last day it invites the 6 big emerging economies, including Russia.
Well, I think time has told us in between that this is gone already, because as we have mentioned before, immediately after Heiligendamm, the financial crisis set in with all its might. And then a new format emerged where all these leaders that were invited at the last day of Heiligendamm, at least the Indian Prime Minister and I think the President of South Africa, and I don't recall the others who were at Heiligendamm, but I'm sure they are all members of G20. And now this new group has found its role, has had to find it very quickly and did. And this is now the table where the emerging powers have their say and can influence certain topics that are of worldwide importance. So there's no wonder that this G7 plus has disappeared from public notice so quickly, because just the developments have been so fast, it doesn't play a role anymore.
So I can't convince either Donata Riedel or Alan Posener as well that perhaps the title could be called Putin Plus. Yes, a point?
No. No, as I said before, there is... Putin has done nothing to sort of be member of this club again. And since last year, there has been change in economics and in the world and in politics and the global setting. So, I mean, we have to look for other formats where Putin can play a role as other countries like China and India, which are very important economies as well. And so we have the G20, and he has his role there. And of course, to solve the pressing issue of the Ukraine, there have to be those talks between Merkel and Hollande and Obama and Putin every day.
One sentence, Alan Posener.
Yeah, look, we're talking with there's the United Nations, where Russia is part of the Security Council. They're in the Quartet solving the Middle East problem. They're in the negotiations with Iran. So we're talking to them, we're working with them. We just don't want to invite them to this club. And that's fine, that's our privilege, isn't it?
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.